Hello and welcome to a premium deck profile for an update to an existing deck. This is Crest Granblue. Granblue is already well known as one of the top tier competitors of the premium format. It has been for a long time, and it always will be unless multiple cards get banned out of the deck. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't need to take notice of new cards added to the format, and we've gotten one of the most important new additions for the deck in a long time, the Crest Maker. The Crest mechanic from Standard gives decks with Stride and Standard the ability to add 5k to the front row for every face card in the G zone, and in Premium that has huge implications. We're able to flip over cards far more aggressively in Premium than we ever are in Standard because of both the History Collection Strides, which flip over a card on turn 3 going first, and also G Guardians, which let us flip over cards on the opponent's turn. Granblue has both a good History Collection Stride and also excellent G Guardians, making it really effective at flipping over cards aggressively when it wants to. And on top of that, one of the main weaknesses of this deck was that aside from the Skull Dragons, the rest of the units in the deck are really bad in terms of power output. You don't really hit big numbers except with Ghost Ship and Skull Dragon, and that's literally 2 to 3 cards out of your deck, and everything else is hitting for base numbers usually. So the deck really was heavily reliant on looping Skull Dragon to try to kill the opponent, and against matchups where it couldn't really do that, like Mega Colony, it just sort of floundered. The other problem is that this deck really wanted to re-ride every turn, and the Crest does introduce a new weakness there because we can only ride cards with Night Rose in their name after we ride the Crest. And that locks us out of certain Bad Bounty and Beatrice lines. But the trade-off is another source of late-game scaling that's going to greatly improve our pressure in the mid to late game. It basically makes the end game for this deck impossible to survive, and it makes the mid game for the deck much more threatening, which speeds the deck up considerably. Overall, I think the changes needed to add the Crest are worth it, especially factoring that Mega Colony just got hit. So someone playing in a Mega Colony meta was able to top with the Crest in their deck, and now that Mega Colony is gone, you don't need to really worry about it as much. And even when Mega Colony still shows around, it's only going to have 2 Gridoras. So the 2 Gridoras means that this deck can now just play to stall. It doesn't need to loop Bad Bounty 3 times. It only needs to loop Bad Bounty once. And then once it does that, it can go back to doing its normal shenanigans. On top of that, we're able to add the Crest without cutting any of the core synergies of the Granblue archetype. So basically, all the tricks of the trade that regular Granblue has, the Crest version can also do. The only downside is we're trimming a lot of the numbers on stuff, so some of the non-core cards of the deck are slightly harder to pull off. A little bit harder to find, a little bit more likely to get damaged and removed from the game entirely, that sort of thing. But without any further ado, let's get into the list. Starting with our starter, Grenache. You have to play this starter with the Crest. Thankfully, there's a V version. We're also playing the G version as a 1-of in the deck because it's a countercharger. And then we have our main grade 3. We're playing 4 copies of Night Rose in a 2-2 split of the V and G versions. You can really be flexible with this number. You can play a 3-1. You can play a 3-1 this way. And as long as you're playing both of these cards, you're probably fine. But you need to play at least one of the V1 and at least one of the G1, just because the G1 gives you access to the History Collection Stride Bandit Rum, which will let you stride going first on turn 3. And the V Night Rose is the best ride target for Bad Bounty, which is our main win condition in the late game. So you need to play at least one of these to put into the drop zone, and you need to play at least one of these to go into going first. So a 2-2 split is pretty nice, and we're playing the D Tommy now, so we can search for these when we need them. It's generally higher priority to find G Night Rose, especially going first, and then you can often not bother searching for the V Night Rose and just put it into drop with Obadiah or something in order to set it up for later. So I'm currently playing the 2-2 split. The guy who topped with this deck was playing 3-1, 3V Night Rose, 1G. So when he went first, he searched for the G Night Rose and dug for it. But when he went second, he just had 3 V Night Roses to go into, and he was able to use the 3 V Night Rose to always have targets to re-ride into. He would Soul Blast out the one he rode last turn and put that to drop, and then he would ride into it again with Bad Bounty, and then he would Soul Blast out a V Night Rose somehow with Beatrice usually, and then he would be able to loop his pressure and still do the bad bounty play while still generating protects with no real downside for being on the Crest. So you could consider that. I personally think a 2/2 will be a little bit safer because you generally want to choose to go first when you can in Premium. And so in about half your games, you're going to have to go first, and just having 2 copies of G Knight Rose to go look for, to go into Bandit Rum, is going to make your consistency a little bit higher for those going first games. Next up, we have Beatrice at 2 copies. This card is really important for the deck. What it does is when placed on V or R, you Soul Blast 1, you call a card not named Beatrice from drop to R. So this is basically everything in the deck except herself, obviously. And then she has a Vanguard skill that we can't use anymore because the Crest forbids us from riding units not named Night Rose. And then it has this other effect on V that we also can't use. This is here primarily because it's a way to call specific cards in the middle of the battle phase. A lot of our effects that call multiple cards either say call different names or call to the same column or things like that. And we're adding a Beatrice into the package there allows you to call in additional cards wherever you want it, usually a Skull Dragon to the other front row circle so that you can get double dragons. But in this case, we don't do that anymore. We've actually cut a dragon from the Crest package, so usually now it's going to be Nightstorm plus dragon, which is fine. We have to play 2 because we really can't afford to have this be damaged and removed from the game, so we need 2 copies, so we can always find at least 1. We're only going to ride this in games where we brick on Crest, in which case it's a fine ride target. Just make sure you still have a Beatrice and drop in order to do defensive plays, because the other main reason we play this is because of its interaction with this G-Guardian. This is Negro Lily. Negro Lily calls a ghosty from your drop zone, which means they can call Beatrice because she's a ghosty leader. And that will let you then call any card you want in the battle phase as a defensive effect. You can call Hanali in order to restrict your opponent's multi-attack. You can call Skeleton Cannoneer to retire your opponent's units, and that's usually the one you're going to be going for. And that gives Granblue a lot of options defensively. It also forces the opponent to play around it even if you don't have it. They're going to have to sequence their attacks awkwardly or dig for resist effects like Bracing Angel Ladder when you don't, even if you don't have the effect. So the mind games aspect is really strong with this deck, and Granblue is really hard to kill, which is important because now we're a late game scaling deck. So I think this is now the premier late game Crest deck. I think Granblue Crest easily eclipses Shiranui Crest in terms of its late game control deck potential. Next up, we have 1 copy of Sea Strike Dragon and Largolf. This is a pretty good utility grade 3. When it's placed on R or put on G, if you have a grade 4 card in hand, or if your Vanguard's grade 4, you can do these effects. If it's on R, you Soul Blast 1 and choose a grade 2 or greater card with a different card name from this unit from the drop, and put it in hand. This is the only copy we play, so it'll basically be grabbing anything we need. It's usually going to be aimed at heal triggers and Columbard, in my experience, but usually heal triggers, because we play grade 3 heals in Premium, and that's going to give us more G-Guardians. And then the G effect we literally can't use unless we were to add a grade 4 to this deck. And there's not really a useful grade 4 in Stoicheia that we'd want to play. And then you can discard this for the cost of Stride and draw a card when you do so. So you can get a little bit of value out of this. Do note that the History Collection Strides are not the cost of Stride. These are act skills in the G zone that you're activating. So you're paying the cost of activating an ability. You're not paying the cost of Stride, even though you are striding into this unit after you activate it. That's also why the Stride crits don't work for the History Collection Strides. Keep that in mind. But any turn after turn 3 going first, you'll be able to use this to draw a card for paying the cost of Stride, which is a nice little bit of extra value out of it. Granblue is a very tight list with a lot of hard search effects, so every card needs to do generally at least 2 things to be worth the slot. Next, we have 1 copy of Mighty Rogue Nightstorm. This card is the Hollow effect. When you place it on R, you can hollow it, and then it dies at the end of turn. And when it attacks on rearguard, it has GB1, counterblast 1. You call a unit with a different name to a circle this unit is not on. So this is just going to give you easy multi-attack for counterblast. If you call a Beatrice this, you can then call another card over the Nightstorm, which will then give you 2 more attacks instead of just 1. And usually you're going to be looping Skull Dragons of this effect. Skull Dragon is our best attacker, and this card is going to synergize a lot with all the cards in our deck that retire themselves after battle. Next, we have Dragon Undead Skull Dragon. This card cannot be normal called, which I believe includes the Guardian Circle. And it has a skill on V or R. It gets 2k for each card in your drop zone. And then at the end of the battle, it attacked, you retire this unit. 2k for every card in your drop zone is gigantic. You frequently are going to have at least 10 cards, usually more like 20 cards. So this is getting plus 20 or plus 40k to itself. It's hitting well over the power of most G Guardians, which is going to generally demand either like 3 or 4 cards out of the opponent's hand to guard, or a perfect guard. And then you're going to throw this at the opponent multiple times because it retires itself at the end of battle. Cards like Nightstorm and Beatrice are going to be able to call it back mid-battle phase to get multiple uses out of it. So our late game aggression is basically just how many times can we throw Skull Dragon at the opponent, and how many perfect guards do they have. It's pretty strong, and it's been the premier centerpiece of Granblue's aggro for a really long time now. Normally we would play 2 copies of this card. But we have to make cuts somewhere because of the Crest. We had to add 4 copies of the grade 1 for the Crest, and that is going to make deck space a much more tight resource. The primary thing I would consider cutting if you wanted to play a second Skull Dragon would be the second Hanli, but I don't recommend doing that right now because Crest Harry is a deck, and Crest Harry is probably the best deck in the format. And if you are not prepared to beat the best deck in the format, why are you trying to play in a tournament, in my opinion? So for now, we're stuck playing these 2 Hanlis in order to make sure we can beat that deck. And that means that we just don't have the room for the second Skull Dragon, in my opinion. Maybe there's something else in here you could trim, but I think the list is pretty tight right now. So just keep in mind that your Skull Dragon might get damaged some number of games and you'll be stuck without having access to it. But the good news is that with the Crest, we now have another source of late game scaling. So we often don't even need the Skull Dragon. Now we get to the grade 2s. We have 4 copies here of Riveting Franch. This is the V ride fixture that every clan got. You can discard these at the beginning of your ride phase if you're on grade 1 or less, and you check the top 5 and add a grade 2 or less from among those cards to hand, and then you shuffle the deck. And then they have a useful effect when you attack while boosted. This one's is that it chooses a card from drop with a different name from itself and calls it R. So this is essentially another copy of Nightstorm, with the exception that you need a booster. And you can call over itself, but that's kind of pointless. You're basically losing an attack for no reason. And the fact that you need a booster is a significant drawback because some of our play patterns are going to result in all of our units dying, and we're not always going to have back row cards. But this is another way to attack with Skull Dragon multiple times in the same turn. So it's a pretty solid card overall. And we're primarily here because the effect for discarding a beginning of ride phase is going to let us dig into the deck to try to find the Crest in games where we don't have it in our opening hand. Next, we have 2 copies of Pirate Swordsman Columbard. This is the best hard search effect in the deck, and one of the best hard search effects in the format. When this unit's placed on V or R, you counterblast 1, you search your deck for up to 1 card and discard it, shuffle, and then you call a card from drop to R, and it has a hard once per turn clause. You can only use the effect of this card with the same name once a turn. So generally, you're going to ride this as your best ride target, grade 2, and you're going to try to put a copy of Ghost Ship into the drop so that you can get card draw plus early aggression. That's going to give you pretty solid grade 2 game. And in the mid to late game, you're just going to put whatever combo piece or defensive piece you don't have into your drop zone for counterblast 1, which you're hopefully going to countercharge back so that you basically spent no resources. Overall, it's a pretty solid card, and we can't play 4 copies of this anymore because we need room for Riveting Franch and the Crest, so something has to give. Next, we have 1 copy of Storm Red Ghost Ship. This card cannot be normal called, just like the Skull Dragon. And then when it attacks, it gets 15k, and then at the end of the battle, you draw a card and retire it. So this is the best early rush card we have. You call it with Columbard's effect, and you get a 24k attacker on turn 2, which is going to hit over 15k shield on most grade 1s. But if you're going second, most 10k grade 2 will guard it for 15k. So keep that in mind. In the mid game, on your turn 3, and sometimes on your turn 4, you can go for looping Storm Red Ghost Ship with cards like Nightstorm and with Riveting Franch. And that's just going to give you lots of extra card draw to help you survive into the late game where Granblue is so strong. Next up, we have 1 copy of Skeleton Cannoneer. This is a defensive card that interacts really strongly with Beatrice and one of our G Guardians. It has Hollow, so it dies at the end of turn. And then GB1, Counterblast 1, when it's placed on an R from your drop, pay the cost. If you do, choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it, and if this unit is hollowed, you draw a card. So that is insanely strong. If you pitch a heal trigger to G Guardian, you're -1 card. Then you call Beatrice, Beatrice calls this kills something and draws a card. So now you're back to 0 cards changed in hand. You have the same number of cards in hand as when you started this chain. Your opponent is down a card because you just killed one of their units, and then you can intercept with this. And sometimes the 5k actually is enough to guard an attack or to save you a card in hand. So sometimes this can effectively end up being +1 overall. It's a really, really strong defensive card. However, we only want to play 1 copy because this card is useless in any other scenario. It's a really bad retire effect, for main phase retire at least. And we're going to hard search it and put it into the drop, so we don't need to play multiple copies. It's also very resource intensive to go for this play. The G Guardian costs a Counterblast, and then the Cannoneer costs a Counterblast. So you're spending 2 damage to do this play, and then you're going to be going to your turn with 2 CB missing that you would have had otherwise. So sometimes playing Cannoneer can lock you out of going for your own aggression, so keep that in mind. The resource management is going to be very delicate. Next, we have 1 copy of Jesse the Ghosty. This has an axe skill in the drop zone. You can retire 2 rear guards and call it from drop. It has a hard once per turn clause for that. And then when it attacks, it gets 5k, and at the end of the battle, you retire it, you countercharge if you have not countercharged with the Jesse the Ghosty ability this turn. Just another easy source of countercharge. It's a unit that can call itself. If our units in play are bad, we can just get this out and get a better unit that countercharges and also put stuff into the drop that we want in the drop from rear guard. Really solid overall. But we only play 1 copy because, again, we're going to hard search it, and it's not good in multiples. Next, we have 1 copy of Greed Shade. When this is placed on R, you discard a card from hand, you put 2 cards on the top of the deck into the drop zone, return a card not named Greed Shade from your drop zone to hand. So this gets any important card that's in our drop back, which is really useful. It means we can set up shenanigans where we like column bard to search for a card, put it in the drop, and then pick it up with Greed Shade to have access to it. Do note that this mill 2 is a significant drawback. It means you are closer to deck out. Deck out is a problem for Granblue, so keep that in mind. But this can get back heal triggers, it can get back perfect guards, it gets back anything you need. Next, we have 1 copy of Sylvan Horned Beast NPix. This is a card that gives the column it's in resist, and cannot be chosen by opponent's card effects to be specific, and it has and then it gets 10k if you only have 3 or less rear guards. So the primary use of this is for 2 decks in particular, for Shiranui and Link Joker. Shiranui requires a dominate attack to go through in order for it to get its restanders to be active. So if you can prevent all dominate attacks, Shiranui is a 3-attack deck, essentially. And this card gives itself and the circle in front of it can't be chosen. So you're able to essentially deny Shiranui all dominate targets if this is your only unit in play. If they force you to call from hand or from drop, you call to the circle in front of the NPix, and they don't get a dominate. And then if they are making you call 2 cards at the same time with rename, your Protect clan, we generate Protect markers when we ride on our grade 3, so we can discard Protect markers to Rene's effect, and those can't exist on rearguard, and so they don't get any dominant attacks from that either. So with NPix in play, we're really easily able to just completely negate Shiranui's game plan, and it forces them to go into their backup strides and try to kill us in different ways. And then against Link Joker, the same thing is kind of true. If we have units in front of the NPix, they can't be locked. If they force us to call anything as a locked card, we can call it to back row, and we can always generally keep the circle in front of NPix and the circle on the other front row column unlocked. And that is going to be really good for basically just turning off Link Joker as a deck. That combined with the fact that we get recyclable perfect guards, that we get protect markers every turn, and G Guardians that can minus crit, we're really good at surviving Link Joker's aggression. Next we have our Crest Maker. I have 3 proxies here, forgive me. My cards have not come in the mail yet. This is Parting Shade. When it rides over Grenache, you get a crest. The crest does a bunch of things. It changes your Night Rose into a 13k base. It gives you 5k to the front row for every face card in the G zone, and then at the when 3 or more cards are discarded from deck at the same time by your Vanguard's ability, you choose a card from among them and put it on the bottom of the deck. So if you have G Night Rose and you retire something, you can mill 3 to call that card back. And then in this case, we're changing that to a mill 2, and we're hopefully putting a trigger back into the deck. So it's a nice little bit of synergy, and it can help mitigate the chance of decking out from G Knight Rose's skill. But we're primarily here for the 5k to the front row for every face card in the G-Zone effect. In the mid game, on turn 4, that will be at least 10k to the front row because of History Collection Strides. It'll be even bigger the later we go and the more G-Guardians we use. We can easily be getting 30k or 40k to the front row. And that's going to make even our Beatrice, even this card itself, it makes literally anything attacking in the front row a dangerous attacker. And that's going to draw a lot of shield value out of the opponent's hand that they can't afford to spend because the dragon is also gigantic. So now everything is hard to guard. And that means they simply, no deck can have enough perfect cards to guard everything at that point. So next we have 2 copies of Tommy the Ghosty Brothers from the Stride deck set from Standard. These have the effect, you can pitch them as a grade 3 for the cost of Stride. And then if you have a Night Rose Crest, you can discard these to search for a Night Rose from deck or drop and add it to hand. So this is going to help us find the V or the G Night Rose, whichever one we need for whether we're going first or second. And it's also going to help you loop them and keep rewriting in the mid to late game. It's also going to pitch to Stride, which is good for helping keep our good cards in hand, so we don't have to ever pitch heals, hopefully. It does a lot for us, and the hard search is really nice. You could play more copies of this card. I just don't know what you would cut. But you could try to find room for a 3rd or a 4th one. I just don't know what it would be. Next, we have 2 copies of Witch Doctor Powdered Bone Negro Bone. This is an act skill in the drop. You can discard a card and you can call a card from drop. The condition for calling anything is that you need 10 or more cards, which is really easy to fulfill in a deck that self-mills. Next, we have 2 copies of Hanali. Hanali is anti-multi-attack. It makes attacks aimed at the Vanguard from rearguards cost counterblast in the 5th or more battle. Which is just most multi-attack decks that are really broken are going to need to spend counterblast to get their multi-attack. And so you're basically straining their resources too much for them to meaningfully pressure you. If you combine this with good damage control, where you only give them 1 or 2 counterblast every turn, and then you play a Hanali, you can effectively shut off their aggression. A lot of Excel clans also don't have the best ways of removing a unit in play, so sometimes you can do something like play a Hanali, and just leave it in play, and as long as it's not in the front row, the opponent can't attack it, and often that's enough to shut down a deck. But usually you're going to want to be safe and remove this, or you're going to want to use a G-Guardian, specifically Negro Lily, to call the Hanali from drop in the middle battle phase and ambush the opponent with it, where they've already missed their chance at retiring the Hanali. Now you're just putting it straight into play, and now they have to deal with the effect, and they haven't been playing around it for that turn. Make sure that you don't conspicuously leave Hanali on top of your drop zone. I'm not saying you should hide it. What I'm saying is if you are planning on using Hanali that turn, don't search for the Hanali and move it to the top of your drop zone. Just leave it where it is. Just remember what your drop zone is, and you'll be able to just spring it on your opponent. Bad players won't think about what's in your drop until you draw attention to what's in your drop. And so if you draw attention to what's in your drop, you're inviting them to think about your drop zone and then potentially to play around it when they wouldn't have. So just keep that in mind. Next, we have our Grade 0 Grenache. This is the G version. This has a Forerunner effect. We're not going to use that. It has a Hollow, which we are going to use. It retires itself in a turn if you activate that. And then it has GB1. When this gets put to the drop from the Hollow effect, you countercharge 2. That's a really, really good effect. Countercharge 2 is absurdly powerful. It means we can safely spend our counterblast on aggression and then use this, pass the turn to the opponent, and have 2 counterblast ready to use for defensive plays on their turn. Really, really strong effect. We're going to hard search it and set it up, and we want to use this at least once a game. We only need to play 1, though, because we have such good hard search. And then we have our orders, 1 copy of Bracing Angel Ladder. You could play Forbidal. Forbidal's fine. It'll search for 2 grade 3s with different names and call them from deck or drop, which is good. You can get like Nightstorm plus Skull Dragon like that, and it'll be good enough to set up. Or you can get, if you play the 2 Skull Dragons, you can play Skull Dragon plus Beatrice, call Skull Dragon. And that's fine, but right now, the best decks in the meta are going to be Granblue, and Harry, in my opinion, both of which are decks that have interactive G-Guardians. G-Guardians that can call units into play that will retire your board. And so by playing Bracing Angel Ladder, we are going to make our kill turn uninteractable, which is going to hopefully mean the opponent is just dead, because our kill turn is very powerful now. And then one Elementary Sanctitude. It's a Blitz Order PG, which gets around a lot of guard restricts, and it's a free Perfect Guard when your opponent strides. Next is the triggers. We have 4 Grade 3 heals. These pitch as a Grade 3 for Stride. They have a useful anti-aggro effect where you get plus 10k and minus 2 crit. These also can be picked up within Largolf, and that's why we want to play these ones. You could play 1 copy of the Countercharge Soul Charge heal, but I think 4 Grade 3 heals is fine. Next, we have our crits. For Rampage Shade, this is the History Collection Soul Crit, or Draw Crit is what they're called. When you damage these, you draw a card, and then when you swing with a Night Rose Vanguard, you can put these into Soul and draw a card and get 5k to the Vanguard. And we're always on a Night Rose now because of the Crest. Next, we have 2 copies of Wild Seas Banshee. This is another Soul Crit, goes to Soul, draws a card, and gets 10k when your Vanguard swings at GB1. Which is just a nice way to draw cards. If you guard with these, you can use Obadiah to call cards from your drop zone, and you can call the Wild Seas Banshee and get a free card draw essentially out of that while also building Soul. Then we have 2 copies of Chad the Ghosty. There is a minor synergy with this card and Beatrice where he becomes plus 5k shield, but we're generally not going to be able to ride Beatrice anymore because of the Crest, so don't worry about that. This is here because it pays for the cost of Stride as a Grade 3. The good news is that Granblue has a lot of cards it wants to discard. These Skull Dragons, the Night Storms, the Beatrice, redundant copies of Night Rose, and so oftentimes you don't really want to use a Stride crit. You'd rather just have the shield value. Next we have this is the significant change of the triggers. We're playing 3 draw trigger PGs now. This deck used to play a suite of Grade 1 PGs to play more crits. We don't have room in the main deck for that anymore. So now we have to play Sentinels, and the History Collection draw crits have the same name as the crit Sentinel for Granblue. So you can't play both in 4/4. So we're playing 3 draw trigger PGs. This will mean that you deck out slightly more often because you have more cards that draw a card in your deck, but I think it's going to be fine. We're generally not going to be getting to as late a game anymore because our Crest scaling is just going to kill the opponent by that point. And then we have 1 Bless Favor. It gives you 1 of every trigger effect when you drive check it. It's a really good over trigger. You could consider playing the Dark OT, which will put a card from damage in a hand and then call a card. And that will give you the ability to get select combo pieces out of the damage zone, which is really nice. And then let's look at the G-Zone, which is mostly the same. We're starting with 2 copies of Bandit Rum. Our History Collection Stride gives us 2 Protect markers, lets us Stride on turn 3 going first. Then we have 2 copies of Ghosty Great Emperor Big Obadiah. This has Counterblast 1, flip a card in the G-Zone, search for 5 cards, put them in the drop, and then call 2 cards for every face card in the G-Zone, and then give them 5k. So this is basically going to perfectly set up our drop zone, get all the combo pieces or all the defensive pieces we need in 1 activation. In 2 activations, you're guaranteed to have everything. In fact, 2 activations, you might be too close to deck out if you get all 5 cards both times. But generally, the first one is going to get us most of the way there, and then you'll have a choice to make based on the size of your drop zone, whether you go into this again and just find a couple cards that you're missing, or whether you go into Bad Bounty to try to kill the opponent. Next, we have 1 copy of Ghosty Great King Obadiah. This is the D Obadiah from the Stride deck set for Standard. The reason we're playing this is that it has the effect to turn a card from G-Zone face up, look at the top 5 cards of the deck, choose a card from among them, and discard it and shuffle, and then choose a card from your drop and call it, and if it has Hollow, give it 5k until end of turn. So this is a resource-free way to set up your drop zone. You're getting whatever the best card to put in the drop out of the top 5 is into the drop, and then you're calling something useful. This is here primarily because a lot of people like to damage deny Granblue. Columbard is a really good grade 2 ride target, and it gives us Ghost Ship, which is a really strong pressure play. So sometimes the opponent is just going to not give you any counterblast to deny you that game plan. And so you just go into this to get set up without spending any resources. That's all it's there for, and it does that job pretty well. Next we have Bad Bounty at 2 copies. Well, we cut down to 2 from 3 because we're not expecting to face Mega Colonies much anymore. This has the effect, at the end of the battle, it attacked, you counterblast 1, and you discard 3 cards, you put this back into the G zone face up, and you ride a grade 3 from drop as stand. You can only ride cards with Night Rose in their name now, so you have to have a V Night Rose in drop to do this. But it's basically going to give you a restanding Vanguard, which is really good. And V Night Rose will also call a board in the middle of battle phase, so you get a lot of extra attacks over the course of a turn with this. Against Mega Colony, you're just writing another card from the drop to get the Protect marker and to get 2 Vanguard swings to pressure the opponent. And that's going to be good enough for you to outlast the 2 Gridors that they're allowed to play now. Next up, we have 1 copy of Bartholomew. This is our late game checkmate stride. When it attacks, you counterblast 1 and choose up to 3 cards with different names from the drop and call them. And those called units get 5k. And then if your drop has 30 or more cards, when your opponent would call cards from hand to G, they must call 3 or more at the same time. So unless your opponent has a ton of G Guardians in hand, this is going to get basically all the cards out of their hand. And unless their G Guardians are really good or interactive and able to remove our units, they're not going to matter because we're going to be getting Skull Dragon multiple times in a turn with this effect. So this card is basically going to be checkmate 9 times out of 10 when you go into this, assuming the opponent is at relatively high damage. You want them to be at like 4 or 5 when you activate this effect. Next, we have 1 copy of Unfading Ship Immortal Galleon. This is the GBH stride. When it's placed on V, choose 5 cards on the drop, call them to R, and they get 10k until end of turn. And then at the end of the turn, you retire them all. So this is just a resource-free way to get a full board with a lot of power, and then you can swing it all at the opponent. If you pick the right cards, you can get multi-attack out of this with Nightstorm or Riveting Franch. And that's going to be a really good option to go into the late game when you're light on resources. You can spend like 1 counterblast, or you can get a countercharger as one of the cards and set up multi-attack with no resources ready to go at the start of the turn. And that's usually going to be good enough to close the game out. And the plus 10k power is going to be pretty significant now because we have the option of going for non-Skull Dragon cards when we have the Crest. And that's just going to add up. Next up is our G Guardians. I will lay them all out. We're playing 1 copy of Negro Nora. This is a Soul Blast 1, flip a G Guardian, and you call 2 cards with different grades from drop to G. So you're going to call 2 triggers because your heal triggers are grade 3. So you can do things like call a crit, call a grade 3 heal, and then get 30k shield, which is pretty good. That'll be 45 total. If you have the over trigger, you can pick that as your 0, and that'll give you a ton of shield value. Next you have Oriana. This has, when it's placed on G, counterblast 1, and the attacking unit gets -1 crit until end of battle for every 10 cards in drop, which I believe doesn't choose. And getting 10 to 20 cards in drop is really easy in this deck, so you're often giving -1 or -2 crit, which can get around a lot of broken effects from the opponent. A lot of decks can like stack up crit on Sentinel Restrict, and you can just be like, -2 crit, I take 0 damage. Then we have 3 copies of Negro Lily. This is the interactive G Guardian. It calls a Ghosty from drop for counterblast 1, and then it gets 10k shield, and then you call Beatrice plus a good card. And the 10k shield matters a lot. That means it's 25k on its own. If you call Cannoneer and you intercept, that is like 30 shield, and you killed a unit, which means you can often effectively guard 2 attacks at once. If you kill like a Restander or something early, you might be turning off as many as 3 attacks with 1 G Guardian. It's really, really good. And then lastly, 1 copy of Messiah, which I have proxied. Messiah generates a Garden Shield and you're going second, and it can unlock your board when you stride into it. And if you have 2 or less damage, I think, you can put a card in the damage zone and draw a card. Something like that. It has a lot of effects. So that is the deck. The attack patterns for this deck are basically the same. You're going for Nightstorm plus Skull Dragon, swinging with the dragon, swinging with the Nightstorm, calling a Beatrice, and then calling another dragon, or just calling a dragon, depending on your resources. If you're doing Bad Bounty, rewriting a V-Night Rose, calling a column, which will be Nightstorm plus Beatrice to call a dragon in the other column and get a full board, essentially. That pattern hasn't really changed. It's in my other video if you want to see it. I have an older video on Granblue. Just skip to the end and you'll see the attack patterns. Really, the only thing that's changed here is the Crest. And a lot of our mid-game plan of like going into Ghost Ship to draw cards and stuff is going to be a lot more threatening now because we're going to be giving +5 or +10 to the front row on that first stride. And yeah, +5 to the front row if we, no matter what, on the first stride. And then on the second stride, it's +10 or +15 or +20. And that's going to give us a lot more pressure. It's going to make that ghost ship hit for really good numbers. It's going to make the Night Storm be not pathetic. It means you can focus a lot more on calling utility cards. You don't need to rely on the dragon anymore. The utility cards will hit such big numbers that sometimes you can go for like countercharge plays or card draw plays and still hit the same amount of pressure as you would with the Skull Dragon, because the Skull Dragon will be gigantic, but once you're at like the 40s to 50s, everything kind of needs a perfect card to not get... You're either eating like 2 or 3 cards at the opponent's hand, or you're getting a perfect card. So once you're past that threshold, you can often go for whatever like the more useful effect is, rather than just go into the Skull Dragons like you would previously. This deck's also a bit more resilient to damaging important pieces, because now, as long as we have the Crest, any assembly of cards is enough to kill the opponent if we can get to the late game. And this deck's really good at getting to the late game. I think this is now the second best Crest deck. I think Harry is the first. Harry is broken. I don't think anybody needs to tell you that. If you know anything about Premium right now, I'm sure you've heard. But Granblue is a pretty strong contender now. It just lost its worst matchup in the format. Mega Colony is gone. It boasts pretty good matchups against Katrina and Shiranui. It's like reasonably well positioned against those two decks. It has probably a decent matchup against most degenerate aggro decks, especially decks that rely on important rear guards, because we can retire rear guards in the battle phase. And now we have late game scaling on all of our cards, not just the dragon. So basically, we got a bunch of new strengths. We lost a few weaknesses. And the only cost for these new strengths is playing the Crest Maker. And as you can see, we're still playing most of the core synergies that regular Night Rose had access to. We still have the same search cards. We still have the same defensive plays. We still have the dragons. We still have Night Storm and Beatrice. We still have multi-attack enablers. Basically, everything is the same. We just trimmed down on numbers on certain things. And we lost a couple utility cards in order to have room for 4 Crests and 4 Riveting Franch. But that's it for now. I do think if you can get your hand on 4 Crest Makers, this is a pretty solid deck to play. The Crest Maker for this deck is about $50 right now. Last time I checked, at least. So if you can get the Stride deck set for Standard in multiples, you could theoretically sell all the extra cards besides the Crest, and you could make not all your money back, but you can make a decent chunk of it back, enough that you won't feel as bad for buying for having to buy 3 decks on top of the one that you were already going to buy. But the value in the new decks is worse than any of the older ones. It used to be that the perfect cards alone would be 10 or 12 bucks, and you could easily make your money back just selling the perfect cards and like the over trigger and a couple other cards out of the decks. That's not as true anymore. So now you're probably best off just asking friends if you can borrow their copy for everyone who bought the deck. So if you're going to travel to a regional, anyone who's not going, just be like, hey, can I borrow your Parting Shade or whatever the card is called? And see if they'll be friendly. Otherwise, yeah, it's tough to get the Crest Maker for this deck. And to be fair, if you can't get it, Granblue is still pretty strong without it. It was already a best deck in format contender, or one of the best decks in the format, without the Crest. With the Crest, I think it's now like fighting with Harry for best deck in the format, probably locked in at second place. And that's a pretty good place to be, honestly. I think this is a perfectly reasonable deck to take, even with all the doom saying about Crest decks and Premium right now. I think this deck is really solid. So if you like playing more controlling or defensive gameplay, I think this is now the obvious choice. And I say this as a diehard Shiranui fan, that I think if you're considering a deck like that, you should take Granblue instead. But that's all for now, and we'll see how the Premium meta shakes out together, hoping for some timely bans in the near future.